with Crystal Risotti.
Welcome to The Agenda with Crystal Risotti. I'm the host, Crystal, and I want to welcome you to the show. Today we're going to be talking about a change of plans, DTrans, and this is part 2. So if you missed the last episode, make sure you go back and watch it. It has a lot of good information on it. I want to start off the show and end the show. I'm changing it up a little bit by telling you to like, subscribe, comment, share, and follow. Follow Revolver Broadcasting. And make sure that you're getting this episode out to your friends, your family. Make sure that they're subscribing so you catch all the content that's coming up in the future and you can go back and watch the videos that we've made already. It's really important to us. Would love it if you would do that, please. Thank you. So in the last episode in part 1, we talked a lot about basically the definition of gender dysphoria. We talked about facts and statistics around it. We talked about the DSM-4 and 5 manuals, which are the billing code manuals, basically, the diagnosis codes. We talked about the Tavistock Clinic in Europe and how it got closed down, but they've pulled a fast one and kind of split it into 2 more clinics. We talked about some posts on Reddit from detransitioners, the link between what we're experiencing in this arena with the gender dysphoria and autism, things on the autism spectrum. Talked about lots of risks around transitioning as well as detransitioning. So in this episode, I want to go further with some of the content from actual detransitioners. We're going to be listening to some testimonies from them. I also want to talk about WPATH, which is an organization that is a global organization used as a resource for gender dysphoria, and they're considered, quote, experts in the field. I want to talk about them because they actually are what the schools go to, what professionals go to for advice. They follow the standard of care that is set forth by WPATH. And once we talk about it, I think it's going to become clear that they're, number one, not scientific at all. It's more opinion. And number 2, that they do have an agenda to market and push this. So that'll be coming up. I want to start off with slide 1. We're going to go through these verses really quickly because you're going to be sick of hearing them eventually, but I think they're really important for you guys to hear and understand, because these are critical to the topics that we're discussing. So let's start with Romans 12:2. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. 2 Corinthians 10:5. Casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, which transitioning and detransitioning, well, actually just transitioning is definitely against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. Philippians 2:5. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. We talked about how pretty sure Jesus wouldn't be wondering about his gender or worried about it. Proverbs 23:7 says, for as he thinketh in his heart, so is he. And I'm going to throw in an extra couple of verses here that aren't on the slide because I just want to mention these. Psalms 139:13 and 14 says, for you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. When we talk about that verse, one thing that came to mind is the whole you don't accept me for who I am. And here I'm just trying to draw the connection between God knitting us together in the womb. He preformed us. He knew us before he knitted us in the womb. That's what the Bible tells us. So there's an intelligent design to us. There's a creator who created us. And then to say you don't accept me for who I am when somebody wants to transition is the antithesis of that. They're actually not accepting themselves for who they are. And that's the thing that I'm not saying that as a sarcastic thing. It's actually something that I'm very empathetic towards, because I see through the garbage to the root cause, and that's the root cause. Let's go to slide 2. These are the communist goals, and we've touched on these before, but I'm going to keep drilling them in because they're very important to note. Goal number 25, break down cultural standards of morality by promoting pornography and obscenity in books, magazines, motion pictures, radio, and TV. Goal number 26, present homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as normal, natural, and healthy. Now remember, these were written before 1963, read into our congressional record in 63. So at the time, transgenderism wasn't a thing, but it would fit under that goal because it's under degeneracy and promiscuity. So those are just the promiscuity part being the focus on sex and the free use of sex with others. Let's go to slide 3. Goal number 32, support any socialist movement to give centralized control over any part of the culture, meaning education, social agencies, welfare programs, mental health clinics, etc. And we're seeing definite control over the population by the acceptance of these things through these social agencies, education, welfare programs, etc. Now, it is a socialist movement behind it. How is that possible? How does it fit? Well, first of all, a socialist movement determines, it's basically like mob rule. The leaders, the elites determine what is to be accepted and what isn't. And you can't speak out against it or you're punished. And that's what this is. It's a lack of freedom. Let's go to slide 4. Goal 39, dominate the psychiatric profession and use mental health laws as a means of gaining coercive control over those who oppose communist goals. Again, if the goals align with transition, gender ideology, and you speak out against it, you're punished. You're not going along with the communist goals. So that's kind of where that lands for me. I want to move to detrans stats. We talked a lot about gender ideology in a former episode. Last time was part 1. Now we're in part 2. I want to get to some meat around the detrans side of things. The problem is you can't pull good stats for how many people have detransitioned. And I'm going to give you some reasons why. Number 1, when you're in a transition program, you're going to healthcare providers. Therefore, you're getting counted. Most people who decide to detrans just stop going. They don't have a conversation with the doctor. They don't go for follow-ups. They don't go for checkups, anything like that, because they just, especially if they've just been on hormones, 9 times out of 10, they'll just go off the hormones. Now, if they've had a major surgery and it's fairly fresh after that, they have to go back for follow-ups and that's captured. But in that case, they would still be in the transitioning phase, not the detrans phase. The detrans phase doesn't happen a lot of times for years after the therapy that person has chosen. So it could just be social transition, could be medical transition, surgical transition, but whatever the people choose to do as a transition therapy, it usually takes years before they decide to detrans. And when they finally do that, they're not in treatment anymore. Most of the statistics are captured by healthcare providers and gender clinics. If people are no longer going to those, they're not getting counted. Nobody is capturing that. Nobody is following it. We are starting to see some studies pop up by smaller organizations, smaller studies trying to get numbers around detrans. But how do you do that when a massive population they're not going anywhere for treatment? They're just living their lives. How do you track that? So they have to volunteer to participate, and you have to find people to volunteer to participate. So it's very difficult to get those studies going. At this point, it's just too early to tell. There is a growing interest in detrans and in detransitioning culture. So I expect that there will be something at some point, but right now it's just too early to tell. I could tell you, being in the pharma industry, I liken this to a pharmaceutical trial. And the reason I say that is I still believe the medical surgery and medical intervention is in a trial state. I don't believe, first of all, The puberty blockers that they use are not FDA approved for that. So that's number one. They've never been FDA approved. But I look at this whole push for gender transitioning as an experiment. It's a human experiment to me. And in pharmaceutical trials, you have different phases of the study. So you start with phase 1 with animal testing. You go to phase 2, people who don't have the clinical indication. So people who would be considered normalized. And then phase 3 is on people with that clinical indication. And then phase 4 is long-term studies. Phase 1 is usually 1 year or so. Phase 2, same. Phase 3, I think the estimate is around 3 years, give or take, for that to take place. And then you go into the observational studies, phase 4, which are long-term oversight of people that had that therapy, whether it be a medication or whatever. I see this as the same thing, and we haven't even gotten close to phase 4 yet. The long-term studies can last like from year 3 to year 20, for example. We're not at that timeline yet. So I expect it to come, but at this point, we don't have good numbers. And then there have been studies that have been published, but I caution you about it because if you're going to look at the studies, you got to go look at how they came up with the numbers. Just like when they said, we have a problem with kids starving in America. You know, the way that they came to that conclusion, one of the questions they asked were, have you ever been hungry? Of course, every kid's been hungry. So you can't just look at the outcome of the studies that they've done. You have to go back and look at how they arrived at that conclusion. And a lot of the experts are saying the studies are faulty. So I'm just going to put that out there. I want to move now to an interview that Blair White, who was a popular YouTube trans person, did with a detransitioner named Shapeshifter. And Shapeshifter in this video is 32 years old. Shapeshifter grew up in a Muslim country, and in that country, Shapeshifter was gay, a male who was gay. And in that country, they didn't accept homosexuality, but they would accept transition people. So if you presented as a female, they would treat you as a female, and that was fine. But if you were a gay man, they would not accept it. So that kind of pushed Shapeshifter into the decision to transition in the first place. At that point, I believe it was just social transition. And what does that mean? That just means they wore the clothes and, you know, grew the hair out or whatever. It's not surgical at that point. Came out as gay at 14 or 15 years old, left home at 16. And I believe Shapeshifter moved to the UK for a while or another country, then came to the US as openly gay and went to graduate school in Massachusetts, where he was introduced to trans people for the first time, other trans people, and influenced by society to transition. So let's go ahead and start this interview because there's some things that Shapeshifter says that I really want to highlight for you, and I want you to pick up on it. So with that, we'll go.
Because you were suddenly comparing yourself to other trans people.
Right.
And, you know, I know that goes on in the trans community a lot. Like, I've met a lot of trans women, and there is like a competitive nature of that world for the ones that do transition. And like, it's like who can get the surgery first and who has the correct surgeries and blah, blah, blah. So I see that. Yeah.
Right. It's definitely right away I started comparing myself to other people online, such as Gigi Gorgeous. I think Gigi was transitioning around the same time. And Princess Jules, like, I remember watching her videos, and she already had bottom surgery, and she was saying it was heaven on earth and how amazing it was. Yeah. So like all of a sudden I was like, in my mind, I didn't look feminine enough, even though like looking back, I was feminine enough. Like, what is feminine enough? It's all relative.
Yeah, enough.
Yeah, what is passing? Like, looking back at it, a lot of those notions were very toxic and kind of sexist in a way, you know?
Yes.
Like, looking back, what is facial feminization surgery? Because first of all, back in the days in Greece, for example, big noses were considered sexy and feminine. Now it's like,
so it adheres to the current beauty standards with a small nose now. And
exactly, which is dangerous because it's permanent body modifications and you're just following a trend right now.
Yeah.
Notice how Shapeshifter is talking about that social influence and how strong it can be. The beauty standards. When a male, I'm going to talk about kids because again, that's where my main focus is. If a boy wants to be a girl, why isn't anybody digging into that and finding out what that means exactly? Because it could mean a plethora of different things. And you may not understand what they're seeing in their mind as a female or as a girl. You may not understand the reasons for it fully. But I think it's important to dig into that because kids need coached. They need taught. Even these young adults need coached and taught about this stuff. They're not fully aware. We're going to see that in a little bit in another detransitioner video. They're not fully understanding what all this means. And what aggravates me to no end is the fact that our medical industry is just rushing them off to affirmative care. There's no questioning. There's no counseling. Nothing required first. In fact, there are so many transitioners that I've seen interviews of that talk about how they went to a clinic and within 15 minutes were prescribed hormones or puberty blockers. It's ridiculous. Any other thing, if an anorexic went to a clinic and said, I think I'm really fat, nobody would be going, oh yeah, you are. Nobody would be doing that. They wouldn't be affirming that and just pushing them through. Why? Because they have a chance to die from it. They know that. The professionals know that. Why they don't understand that here, I don't know. Why there's such a push for the affirmative care, I don't know. The only thing I can come up with is it's an agenda. That's the only thing that makes sense. Now I want to look at another interview with two detransitioners. This one's called A Deep Dive into Detransitioners. It's Walt Heyer, who transitioned in his 40s and detransitioned after 8 years, and Grace Ladinsky Smith, who transitioned in her 20s and then detransitioned a couple of years later. Now, Walt is an old gentleman. You're going to see that. You can see him on the screen now. He's old. So this isn't something new, although the push for it is new, and that's what he really speaks to. Walt actually is the owner of the website Sex Change Regret. And if you have an interest in this content, please go check out that website. The link will be below in the description. They have had over 2 million views, which tells you that there is an interest in the content around how to detrans. So with that, let's start.
I appreciate that. So let's start with your backstory so that people understand how you came to these opinions very honestly and not without some fair amount of trauma. Walt, I'll start with you. I was fascinated to see you were born in 1940. Now, that means you went through all of this at a time when it was verboten. You know, it wasn't like today where you're surrounded by a bunch of pushers. But in your own personal experience, you kind of were. You were out in San Francisco when you decided to actually go through with transitioning, and reading your backstory, it seems like you kind of did have some pushers. Let's start before that. When you're a little boy, what happened? 'Cause I know there are a couple central traumas that you think played into your belief you needed to transition.
Yeah, thank you, Megan, for allowing both of us to share this. But yeah, my story started in 1944 before there was any dialogue about the words they use today, transitioning and transgender and gender dysphoria. As simply put, what I've learned now in 77 years is that when grandma made me a purple chiffon dress when my dad dropped me off, and she would babysit me for the weekend, and he would go fishing in the California mountains for 2 or 3 days with my mom. And so she made me this purple chiffon dress and put it on me, made it specifically for my little 4-year-old body, and told me how cute I looked. and it all seemed kind of benign and sort of fun. What I didn't realize, and what I've learned in the 77 years, is that putting me, a 4-year-old boy, in a dress and then telling him how cute he looks and then dressing me up every time I was over there in that dress really became emotional and psychological child abuse that eventually led to sexual abuse. And so what I really talk a lot about, Megan, is the fact that people don't understand the consequences. We just sort of go through these motions about cross-dressing kids, and we think it's cool and it's acceptable. Well, it's not so cool. It is acceptable, but it's also very harmful. And so
stop for a second. So I want to touch on that a little bit, because imagine this little 4-year-old boy and grandma's putting him in a dress that she made especially for him. But here's the kicker. She kept it a secret from his parents. So if it was all benign, as Walt thought at that age, and it was all on the up and up and nothing was wrong with it, why did she feel the need to keep it a secret from his parents? Why did he feel the need to keep it a secret from his parents? Because he also didn't tell. That tells you right there's something not right about it. That should have been a warning sign right there. He goes on to say, I think we're going to skip ahead, Josh. He goes on to say that he wore this dress for, I believe, 2 years at his grandma's house. And then his dad's brother, adopted brother, so his uncle, molested him. His dad found out about the dress. His mom and dad did. And then he got whooped. So physically abused. I mean, a 4-year-old to 6 years old, almost 7, the damage is done at that point to the psyche of a kid. Remember, I talked about seeds are planted, and then seeds are those seeds that are planted are thoughts or exposure. The kids turn those into thoughts by thinking about things. They ponder it. They're curious, so they want to know everything about it. So whatever you expose your kids to, they're going to end up thinking about it and pondering it and considering it. Then those thoughts can turn into actions. Not always do, but can. And you have to think ahead as a parent about what you're allowing, because in the famous words of my husband, what you allow, you teach. So you have to think in terms of that with kids. You allow it, you're teaching them it's okay. Okay, let's go to the next section, which is 659.
So you have the psychological and emotional abuse of being cross-dressed by grandma, and then you have the physical abuse with the hardwood floor plank, and then you have the sexual abuse. All these things occurred before I was 10 years old. And what we know today is that this is called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and it's a traumatic childhood. And at that point, the proper thing would have been to have me treated for trauma and understand that it's adverse childhood experiences cause the brain to be altered at the level of our identity. And this is kind of what we know today. It's been studied since the 1990s, but nobody's talking about it. And so I thought I should have been a girl when I was 10 and 11 and 12. And I took on an identity when I was 13 of Crystal West as a secret. I didn't go out because in those days, this is the early 50s, nobody's really talking about this idea. And so I was secretly cross-dressing and hiding everything I was doing, but yet I had all this feelings going on about I was born in the wrong body. And then Christine Jorgensen hit the airwaves and became kind of the big deal in the 50s. And that's what led me to think, oh, that must be who I am. So I had a way to identify what I thought I was through Christine Jorgensen. It was a false premise, but because no one has ever in the history of mankind ever changed their gender. So, but we buy into this idea. And so that led me on. I was never homosexual. I ended up going to college, getting married, having 2 children. I had a successful career in the automobile industry. I also worked on the Apollo space missions as an associate design engineer in the area of cryogenics, struggled with alcoholism and drug addiction as a result of not dealing with the adverse childhood that I had, the sexual abuse, emotional and physical abuse, which should have been treated much earlier in life, led me to go to a gender therapist who said, well, you have gender dysphoria and what you need is hormones and surgery. But there was no voice like Walt Heyer out there at the time. Nobody's saying the bridge is out. Don't do this. It's not going to fix you. It's only going to cause more harm and ruin your life. And so Dr. Paul Walker, who was the author of the original standards of care that are in place today, was my therapist, told me I needed hormones and surgery. I bought into it. I had the surgery in 1983 and went on to live a life of Laura Jensen, working for the federal government at FDIC and the Postal Service, only to regret and realize that I never needed surgery. I never needed hormones. I did need therapy for the trauma that had been caused during my life, the physical, emotional, and sexual abuse that I suffered. And that's actually, Megan, what I find in 100% of the people, the thousands of people that I've worked with over the last many years. I mean, I detransitioned well over 30 years ago. And my website, Sex Change Regret, has had well over 2 million views just in the last few years. So we know this is a serious problem, regret, that is. And it's how do we go about it? Well, we realize that things happen in their childhood that cause them to not like who they are. And they adopt this idea that they can go through a gender change that is quite frankly impossible, because changing genders, quite frankly, was all fixed and innate and unchangeable at the time of conception when the sperm hit the egg. So the game was over. So we're really only able to change our identity cosmetically, but we can never biologically change who we are. And that's kind of where I am. And I've been working with people every single day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for over a dozen years.
Did you catch what he said about these adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs? He said they modify the brain. That's a serious, serious thing to me. And instead of our psychiatry, psychology, that whole industry, counseling industry, instead of them dealing with that and helping kids, because again, I'm more concerned about kids, although adults matter too, but instead of helping these kids through this, they're just rushing them into hormones or puberty blockers, or even parents are socially transitioning their kids so early. I'm sure you've seen what is his name? Desmond, whatever. He's a drag kid, started when he was like 3 or 4 years old in drag. That's not a kid thing. That's a parent thing. That's a parent problem. Jazz Jennings is another one who was pushed into it as a kid. And I don't know if you followed it, Jazz's show or anything, but I watched excerpts of some of her latest shows and her struggles. I say her. I'm going to do that for some of these. I'm brokenhearted about this stuff because of my personal situation in my life that has happened. And I don't understand why people don't understand how serious this is. It's not just some switch you can flip. Like Dr. Heyer said, like Walt Heyer said, you're never going to be the opposite sex, ever. You can put makeup on and dress up. You can play football, whatever the opposite sex does, you can try. But you're never going to be the opposite sex. And I think people are actually starting to wake up to this. Let's go to the next clip.
That's exactly
the trauma,
right.
This point that you're making about the unwillingness to examine other traumas that may be leading to these feelings of confusion around gender is the culprit. It's the culprit that we're dealing with on so many levels today. And it's what makes what the doctors are doing so shameful. You know, to the contrary, if you try to explore what else is happening, is there a divorce in your family? Do you suffer childhood trauma? they accused you as a doctor in today's day and age of conversion therapy, of trying to engage in something close to conversion therapy, as opposed to just figuring out whether you really have a transgender or gender dysphoric person in front of you.
Yeah. So when they talk about conversion therapy, I just wanted to let you know that it was banned in California a few years ago. So you can't even try to counsel people in California. And it's spread to other states. It's kind of become the standard of care at this point. But think about it. Why would they do that? Conversion therapy, he talks about it a little bit, I think, more in this video. But it was done for very few people, by very few people. And yet California found it necessary to completely ban it. Why would they do that? Conversion therapy was looked down upon because it was trying to get to the root cause of why somebody had gender dysphoria and try to help them fix it so they didn't have it. It would be the same that you would do with somebody with anorexia. You try to help them to fix it, but it was banned. So let's go to the next clip.
Grace, you came at this at a much different point in time. You are 28 years old now, so you were born in the 90s, if my math, my math is correct. And I would imagine that. So, like, how old were you when you first started to wrestle with issues of gender?
Well, I was sort of lightly wrestling with gender identity from, I think, like 19 or 20 in college, more along the lines of considering myself maybe non-binary, which is more of a I don't conform to any gender role style identity. And I had really been very like socially conscious, very involved in like feminist analysis and like leftist sort of analysis of society. And I felt, I think, very, I guess, socially anxious and like insecure about like my place in society and about my body. And that escalated in my 20s. When I was 22, I started to seriously question my gender and question whether medical transition might be right for me. This coincided with a really dark period in my life where I had a bout of intense depression and suicidal ideation. And during that really dark time, the idea that my sort of lifelong body problems and social anxiety could actually be caused by being transgender and actually like needing a different shape and sort of body to thrive felt like an epiphany to me that I had just come to. And I was obsessed with the idea, and I thought that it would be the thing that would save me and allow me to finally feel normal after a young adulthood, just feeling weird and out of place. And, I could put together evidence from my past, like asking for a boy's haircut when I was young was something that I did. I often had short hair. I often was, resistant to different ways that people treated me as a woman that I felt were, stereotypical and, putting unfair expectations on me. But honestly, it was a period of intense mental distress. And I connected all the dots in my head, and I thought that I was transgender and supposed to be a man. So.
All right. I have so much to say on this part. So, first of all, both the people in this video transitioned at a later age in life. They weren't kids. I want to ask you, like with Walt, it was a different time, but with her, she became obsessed about her body. How do you become obsessed about your body? You don't have a whole lot else going on, probably. She was born in the 90s. Think about it. We've had social media, the internet, other things available, exposure to different things that we weren't exposed to before. I can tell you when she talks about she had short haircuts and she, didn't really feel like she was feminine. She was more tomboyish, which is also becoming a thing. People are actually acknowledging that a tomboy is a thing again. There are so many females that have that when they're young. I would have been known as a tomboy when I was young. I've mentioned that before. If I grew up in this time frame, I have no doubt whatsoever that somebody would be saying I was probably trans and trying to push me through this whole disaster. But she, growing up in the 90s, then in her 20s in college, she was exposed to something, because otherwise, when she thought back on these things, it wouldn't equal transgender in her mind. When I was growing up, there wasn't such a thing as transgender. You didn't hear about it on TV or the radio or social media or any of that. So, you know what? It was just normal to be a tomboy. It was okay. It was normal. We didn't have to rush into anything. I said before, I'll say it again. I don't know any female in particular that had a great time in puberty, that loved it. Not one. You go through a lot of emotional changes during that time, physical changes. You don't know how to handle things. It freaks you out, man. I'm just going to say it like that. It can freak you out. And even if somebody's telling you what the stuff is that's happening to you, it still doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel right at all, which is the problem with going off of feelings, right? So I just wanted to bring that up with her, because I think the difference between when I grew up and now, or even her age, is the fact that that wasn't an option for us. We just grew out of it. We outgrew it. We grew through it. Some people changed to where, they liked long hair or whatever. Some people didn't, and that was okay too. It didn't make them any less of a female. All right, so think about that. Let's go to the next part, please. I'm going to lean over, so.
I sought out a gender therapist and a hormone providing clinic. The situation with the clinic was they did informed consent. So all I needed to do was answer the question, why do you want to go on hormones? And I told them being a woman is not working for me. And they said, sounds good. And they gave me a bunch of papers to sign, and I got on testosterone. At first, I felt great. I felt like I was on the right path because I was feeling more energetic. I wasn't as stuck in this quagmire of depression anymore. And I took that as a sign I was on the right path. And then very quickly, because it was so uncomfortable to bind my breasts, and because I thought that when I truly started passing as a man, I could really start to move on and build my life, I signed up to get a double mastectomy, also known as top surgery. I did that after about 4 months on hormones, I think. So yeah, it was very fast. I was in an obsessive state of mind. The surgery was an intense experience, and I started feeling some regrets and doubts afterwards, but pushed them down for a while. And then about 5 months later, I was feeling so just distressed and overwrought with doubt at how the surgery had made me feel that I decided to take a break from testosterone, and I slowly started to realize that I had made a huge mistake.
It's sad that people have to go through that to get to that point. And if we were doing our job as a profession, a medical profession, we wouldn't have as much of that, I don't think. Notice that she talked about informed consent, and having the background I have, again, I want to talk about that a little bit. She kind of blew over it like informed consent was just them asking her questions, but then you notice afterwards she said they gave her a bunch of papers and she just signed them. Okay, informed consent is something that's required in the pharmaceutical trial industry when you're giving people a drug. So I find it interesting that this requires informed consent. If you want to know more about the rules around informed consent, You need to go look up the Helsinki Declaration that has been in place since after World War II. The informed consent purpose is to inform people of the risks of whatever they're going to do. So in this case, it should have been the surgery. In another case, it might be the drug symptoms, like side effects from a drug. And they're supposed to ensure that you understand the informed consent, not just they give you papers and you sign them and push them away and move on. They're actually supposed to work with you on it and make sure you understand all those risks, which it doesn't sound like they did with her. They just let her sign them and go. Also notice that she talks about testosterone. When she first started taking it, it took care of her depression at first. And we talked about in the last episode how detrans people were reporting that it felt like they were high when they first started on T. So that explains how it takes care of the depression for a little while, but then once your body adjusts to it, it's a whole nother story. And then how sad is it that shortly after she had her double mastectomy, she realized what a mistake it was. And it's just too late at that point. And even though she was a young adult, we talked about this before too, the brain doesn't fully develop till you're 25. These young people still need this guidance. They still need people to help them navigate through this. They still need the medical profession to actually do their job and help them with the psychiatric side of transitioning and gender dysphoria. Let's go with the next clip.
What else happened to you when you went on testosterone?
Well, my voice started to deepen. I started to grow hair on my body. It had a sort of antidepressant effect, which was nice because I had been sort of wallowing in deep sadness and like aimlessness. So that ended up giving me a placebo effect for a while that I was on the right path. It also gave me, I think, energy, and it also stifled my more emotions of like sadness and fear, which may have contributed to going forward with the surgery so quickly.
Yeah. So again, with the antidepressant effect on the testosterone and on the surgery itself, that was something she experienced. The voice changing, you can tell her voice isn't fully back to normal, but you know, some people have deeper voices. I do, so it's fine. It affected the hair growth, her energy level, and here's the part that I think is interesting. It stifled the emotions. So when a female transitions to male, and Dr. Jordan Peterson talks a lot about this, which I think is incredible. When women hit puberty, when girls hit puberty, they differentiate in how their body changes from boys. So women become more emotional at that point. And he talks about that. Well, the therapies that she was on stifled her emotions. And many detrans people will then say when they go off of the hormones or they detrans, those emotions come up and well up because they've been stifled. They haven't gone away. They will have experiences where they're just highly emotional for days on end. And that's a sad reality too. And I think we have a couple more clips from this.
And were you somebody who was down the internet rabbit holes on transitioning and top surgery? You know, we see this very common, especially amongst women younger than you who go through this, where they've spent 3 hours or 5 hours a day on Reddit or YouTube and seeing, you know, it's like they talk about top surgery, which is like this, as you point out, this sort of carefree way of saying double mastectomy. I mean, having your body parts cut off. And for a young woman, you know, it's a massive decision. But I wonder whether you were one of those people who was on the internet all the time being fed information like, it's not a thing and you're going to love it and it's all good. Come on in.
Yeah, I definitely think that internet addiction played into my dissociation from my body and also imbibing vast quantities of material fantasizing about how awesome transition would be was a huge part of my routine around that time. Looking back, it's easy to see that I was in an obsessive rabbit hole, but I think that it's a pattern that a lot of detransitioners talk about, is sort of getting sucked into this world and just exposing yourself over and over again to this promotional material for these surgeries and hormones, essentially.
Again, I don't know how many times I got to talk about it. Exposure plants seeds. Seeds then turn into thoughts with young people and kids. Those thoughts are entertained, they're obsessive, and they can turn into actions. That's exactly what happened with her through social media marketing. And I'm going to call it what it is. It is a marketing attempt. Reddit, YouTube, the internet, all of it plays a part. And she's a case in point where that exposure became rooted and turned into thoughts, and she entertained those thoughts out of curiosity, and then they consumed her, and they did turn into actions for her. Let's go ahead with the next clip.
Because, you know, it's a very different time. But when you did it, so my math is correct, it'd be around 2016, we had already crossed over to snaps, you know, for anybody who declares themselves trans. It had already been placed. We went from like, why is it okay to hate transgender people, to every transgender's person's decision must be celebrated as if 100% unassailable, and any doubt expressed about whether it was right for this person makes one a bigot, and so on. So did you experience that, like, sort of snaps and positivity and like society patting you on the back for this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I certainly had people in my life who were like worried about what I was doing, but no one really questioned me all that much. And a lot of people were very positive. And I think they meant well by that. You know, I don't take that badly, but it's not a cultural script that allows for a lot of, you know, saying to someone like, hey, you seem like you might be in a weird place, what might be the factors going into this? And especially from like, you know, doctors and therapists are the sort of people that I would hope would ask those questions. And certainly in those cases, I just didn't really get any investigation from those figures.
No one questioned her decisions. No one. No one stepped up. No one presented any opposition to it. They just accepted it. And that's where we are in society today. We have to stop just accepting it. We have to actually care about these people. That's the part that's missing, I think. And why would that be? Well, because there's a whole lot of moolah to be made in this industry. A lot of money. We talked about that in the last episode. It's incredible how much money they're making. And they're prioritizing that above the safety of kids, the safety of adults, young adults. They don't care about the safety. It's all about the agenda and all about the money. So I'm really getting tired of it, and I hope everybody else is too. With that, let's look at the next clip.
10, 15 years.
Yeah, I think that's so important to talk about, because I was driven, but what I was really driven by that I realized today as we're talking, Megan, is being sexually abused and physically and emotionally abused. I did not want to be who I was.
Self-loathing. He didn't want to be who he was anymore. How many of these people that are gung-ho and transitioning are like that? They have something in their past that they're ashamed of, that bothers them, that gives them the thought that they're not worthy, they're not good as they are, that they're worthless, they're valueless, and that makes the transition appeal to them even more. How many of those people out there are there? We don't even know, because, again, our medical industry, our society is failing these people. I found that really interesting. And the bottom line to that is that trait is completely oppositional to what God thinks of us and what he created us to be, who he created us to be. Transitioning occurs when you don't accept yourself for who you are, who you were made to be, or who God says you are. That's when it happens. I want to go on to the next clip, please.
A woman as I was born.
Well, it was sort of a series of steps because, as you can imagine, it was really hard to admit to myself that I might have made a mistake of that, that scale. And I had to walk it back slowly. So I thought, well, maybe I've overshot. Maybe like I want to be more androgynous. So I stopped the testosterone. And once I stopped the testosterone, a lot of the feelings that the basically steroid had suppressed in me started flooding back. And it's hard to explain because it's so intense, but I would just describe it as a sort of an epiphany again, that I just had been basically like shoving things under the rug and like lying to myself about what was really like going on. And it just became impossible to deny that my expectation for transition, which was that I would feel more like me and more natural, whatever that meant, had not been met. I felt like I was playing a role, and I felt like I was trying to bury my emotions and become someone else, which, like Walt said, I think is pretty common. And it also was clear that I had just really hurt myself really, really badly by having a mastectomy. And there was sort of a truth to that in my body that I could no longer deny. So it took me a few months to come to terms with that. But then I realized that the whole framework of obsessing over my gender identity and like trying to control how other people saw me was just really unhealthy for me.
I love that she said that. A few things about that. We talked about this earlier. Stopping T just released all the emotions that had been suppressed for so long. The expectation for transitioning, she said, didn't meet her expectations. So it was unrealistic to begin with. Again, she's a young person. It's up to the professionals. It's up to the older generations to help them understand that. She tried to become someone else, but ended up just playing a role. That's something that she said that I found that was really interesting. And then talking about the permanent damage. So bottom line is she became obsessed about her gender. I believe that happens with a lot of people, and it's through exposure. How? Through marketing campaigns, through the media, through money, meaning big pharma. And they don't tell you this, but you're going to become a lifetime patient if you transition, medically especially. And then also a contributing factor is a godless ideology. I think that's the biggest thing right there, because, again, if you're a believer, then you know that God created you to be who you are, and that he created you the way that he saw fit, that you're valuable, that you're worthy, that he loved you so much he sent his son to die for you on the cross to forgive sins, because there was no other way to restore that relationship to God once sin entered the world. So there is a value that I believe Christianity, but also other faiths can also give that to human life and to the individual. That's also why the individual is so important. We're going to stop the podcast here. I have a lot more to provide, but we're going to make a part 3, so stay tuned for more. That will also contain a lot of the detransitioner content, testimonies from them. I'm going to be using Reddit again because that's it's an incredible source of first person accounts when people are going through detransition, and the thoughts that they have and the guilt they feel from not knowing any better. And imagine a lot of times suicide rates are higher after medical surgical transitioning. Can also be high after detrans. You heard Grace's story, how devastated she was because she came to a realization of how much damage she had done to herself. So when I talk about this stuff, it's not, again, coming from a judgment perspective. It's really, I have a heart for it because I feel like we're just all failing. We're all failing these people. We should be concerned about them. We should care about them. We should have a heart for them and compassion. There is good news. We can fight this, and a lot of fighting is going on. So, mentioned this before, many countries in Europe are stopping the gender affirmation push. So they're pulling back on it. They're actually implementing better counseling and psychological practices before pushing kids into hormone therapies or even adults. They're really pulling back on it. And there's also more and more resources available to people considering detransitioning. Let's jump to slide 13, Josh, if we could. Thank you. This is one that is actually a leftist, a leftist site, but you can see it happening on the left as well. So this is LGBT Courage Coalition, and it's on Substack. And here they're talking about the fact that they're speaking out from within the LGBT community, and they'll no longer be silent. They feel like when people are pushing back on this, that they're censored, and they're fighting against that. And they're wanting to push forward with actual legitimate conversations. And then some other resources, if you're interested in learning more. We talked about Sex Change Regret with Walt Heyer earlier. That's slide 14. You can certainly check that out. There's another one, slide 15, called beyondtrans.org. It's a good resource for people. And then another one, slide 16, and this is an organization called therapyfirst.org. The links to these will be in the references, so be sure to check those out. And with that, I'm going to tell you, if you like the content, I'm going to remind you, hit like, subscribe to Revolver Broadcasting, and follow, share, comment, put comments or questions in so we know that you're watching and we can respond accordingly. I'm happy to point you in any directions that we can. If you are somebody who's struggling with this, we're not professional counselors or anything, but we've done enough research to know the good sites to go to and the good people to seek out. And definitely go to revolverbroadcasting.com and check out all the other shows and content there, other podcasts. You can catch this on YouTube, on Facebook, Rumble, and anywhere you get your audio podcasts. And with that, I will say good day.